Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and if this is your first time here, welcome. I don't normally sound like this. I'm not saying that I got real silky golden pipes or anything either, but normally I don't sound so sick and ratty and gross. I just don't feel very well right now. Well, that's not true. I really feel pretty good. I just got this congestion ick, and so I don't sound good, but I want to hang out with you anyway and do this. So, hey, here I am. Thanks in advance for your patience with my voice. Again, if this is your first time here, we're working our way through the book of Matthew, nice and slow-like. And the point of this exercise is not first and foremost for me to convince you of all of my things and get you to be a part of exactly every single one of precisely all of my religious convictions. The goal here is a little bit more on the let's just think about it and try to understand exactly what the document says and what it is side of things. So we're going through it slow so we can take a lot of time on things like literary context and consideration of where the characters were at headspace-wise and theological context and historical context and all of that stuff. And I think it's been really fun. And if this is your first time here, you can jump in right here and you can go back to the beginning anytime you want and power through it all and catch up. And I hope you will. And at this point, we are at a brief pause at the beginning of Matthew chapter 24, which is like the home stretch. We're getting to the final stuff about the life of Jesus described by his disciple Matthew. And the reason we're stepping aside is because this building, the temple, factors really heavily into the story of Jesus down the home stretch. It would have been something that would have come with a whole lot of connotations for everybody in the original audience. And so we're bouncing back into the Old Testament for a few days here to jog our memory and to get ourselves well oriented to the story so we can put ourselves in the shoes of the original audience to whom this was written, the original audience who would have witnessed this in the first place. And I'm saying the story of the temple in the Old Testament happens in 2 chapters, but in a way, it's kind of like a prologue and then 2 chapters. The prologue being the tabernacle. When the Israelite people first come out of captivity in Egypt, God dwells among them in this tent, this portable dwelling place for God. And in Leviticus chapter 9, we see that God miraculously confirms that, yep, I am with you. And in some weird way, I am with you like in this place as my little portable house as I go along. And then that same miraculous confirmation is repeated in full-on chapter 1 of the story of the temple, which we've been looking at in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, which is the story of the dedication and the existence and eventually the destruction of Solomon's temple. And this thing was a monster. It was gigantic. It was lavish. It was impressive. Certainly one of the most remarkable things humans had ever built to date. And just like back in Leviticus 9, God shows up at the dedication of the temple and is like, yep, we're on the right track here. I am here. I'm in on this too. Let's rock and roll. That horrible paraphrase of God is very, very much mine. And I apologize to him and everyone for that sloppiness. Chapter 2 of the Old Testament story of the temple is the rebuilding of the temple, which we're going to get to very, very soon. But first, we got to round out chapter 1 of the temple, and that is the end of it, the destruction of Solomon's glorious temple. And that happens at the end of 2 Chronicles, the very final chapter, that's 36, as well as at the end of 2 Kings, which is like 25. Are there 25 chapters in 2 Kings? I'm going to look now. I'm committed to this. I want to know. And all of you who are like really good at the Bible, there are 25 chapters in 2 Kings. So that's what we got. Both the 2 Kings and the 2 Chronicles accounts leave us with a little bit of hope, but both of them are also pretty straightforward about like, this is what you get. You had a deal with God, and the deal was that he's going to be your God and you're going to be his people, Israelites. And if you obey him, everybody's going to know that he's the one true God because he's going to bless you. And if you disobey him, everybody's going to know that he's the one true God because he's going to punish you. And so both the authors of these projects attribute this judgment at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar to God as a continuation of the deal made with Moses because of the violations that God's chosen people had racked up against him. Now, of course, there are a bunch of people in this conversation right now and outside of this conversation would say, yeah, I mean, I think the Bible's an important book, but I don't think that there's an actual God behind any of this stuff. And one place where folks who are theists like me and think there is a God behind this, and those who are atheistic or skeptical and don't think there's a God behind this, one place where we can agree is that surely we can also track the political deterioration that had gone on for generations prior to this collapse. It's not hard to see what happened here. There's a family fallout after the age of Solomon. He apparently, for all of his wisdom and ability to really jot down great, witty, pithy pointers about how to raise a kid the right way and what wisdom looks like that are recorded in the book of Proverbs, apparently he wasn't great at passing that along to his kids, because his kids are a dumpster fire and they fight with each other and they murder, and the country splits in half. And at times then the northern half and the southern half, Israel and Judah, get along. At other times they don't get along. Eventually the northern kingdom provokes the Assyrians so badly that in like 720-ish, the Assyrian army comes in and topples the northern kingdom and takes them away into captivity. And all of those people, all of that heritage, basically 10 tribes of Israel, are more or less lost to history. Well, the southern kingdom goes on for a while, and they'd had more noble, just, God-fearing, God-trusting kings. But still, they were a mess as well. And the theme throughout is that they trust in themselves. They don't trust in God. And this kind of goes all the way back to the very beginning, when there was a theocracy amongst God's chosen people, but they really wanted a king like all the normal countries had. And they were warned by the prophet, like, I don't know, the taxes and conscription and bad character. You sure? And they're like, yeah, we want a king for sure. Give us a king. And so here, the chickens kind of come home to roost as the last vestiges of this kingdom that God established gets torn apart by the Babylonians from the east under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. Here's how that went down. 2 Chronicles 36. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. This is of Judah. And he reigned in Jerusalem, which is the capital of Judah, 11 years. That's also where the temple is. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God, and did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke the word of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him take an oath in God's name. He became stiff-necked and hardened his heart, and would not turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations, and defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or aged. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were complete in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken to Jeremiah. There's so much going on there, and maybe someday we'll do a book of the Old Testament and we'll really deeply break all of this down. But there are a few things that probably popped for you if you've been with me through the book of Matthew. One is the language that is used by the author of 2 Chronicles to characterize how hard-hearted and stiff-necked God's chosen people were, how they were rejecting the messengers of God that he sent them, and how God kept sending them again and again. It's reminiscent of, chapter 21, 22, back over in Matthew, where we get the parable about the vineyard and the tenants and how the master keeps sending representatives, but they keep rejecting and injuring the representatives, and then eventually they kill the master's son when he sends his son to get things figured out. And therein lies part of the value in going back and carefully looking at Old Testament stuff, is then things that Jesus says pop that much more because the original audience was intimately familiar with everything we just read. I mean, deeply, profoundly familiar. I mean, if you are an Atlanta Falcons fan, 28-3, that means something. Every single person who is an NFL, American football, Atlanta Falcons fan knows what 28-3 means. Everyone who is a Denver Broncos fan knows the name Raheem Moore or the Mile High Miracle. And normally for the Mile High City of Denver, Mile High Miracle would intone something good happening for its home team, the Broncos. But in this context, it refers to a day of utter ruin and shame that the franchise will never live down. Whatever tribe or group you're a part of, you have some things in your lore that are so legendary, so well known, usually tragedies, that even the vaguest reference to that thing conjures the whole story. And that would be the case with what we're looking at here in 2 Chronicles 36 and the original audience hundreds of years later in the time of Christ. Everybody knew this stuff like the back of their hand. This is their darkest day. Or maybe I should say that this story about the destruction of the temple and Nebuchadnezzar was the darkest day anyone could possibly imagine as they stood there and talked to Jesus in the temple until about 40 years later when the Romans would destroy the second temple. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Simply put, this passage tells the story of all of the potential and beauty of the presence of God with his chosen people being squandered by his chosen people as they do not listen to what God says, as they trust in all of the wealth that built the temple instead of realizing that God was behind the wealth that built the temple, and their slow, gradual, calloused rejection of God, according to the author of 2 Chronicles, leads them to this place of abject ruin. But as we're going to talk about next time around, as we move forward in this story of the temple, we're going to see that there is a teeny tiny little glimmer of hope that lingers here at the end of 2 Chronicles. I set out to cover all of this temple stuff in like one day, but I'm really glad we're just getting the whole thing in. I hope you're having fun with it. And if you're not, hey, you're still here. So thank you for that as well. We'll do a couple more days on this, and then we're going to go and get into Matthew 24. And I think we'll find this business to have been very helpful in appreciating what Jesus is saying there better. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.